Welcome everybody to today's ComAI lectures, which we have again together with the Presse Club here at this beautiful building. We have today a very, very special guest, Benedetta Brevini. So I'm really very happy that she can visit us. We already tried to convince her to get her last semester. In the end, it was not possible, but well, half a year later, the traveling schedule offered a chance to us. Traveling schedule, this already means something in this case. So Benedetta is on the one hand in Australia, where she's Associate Professor of Political Economy at the University of Sydney, but at the same time, visiting professor at NYU in New York. So Bremen is on halfway in between, I imagine.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
this was our luck, I would say.
Very convenient.
Yeah. So for all the ones of you who don't know her work, she was visiting fellow at London Schools of Economics and Political Science, where Benedetta also got her master's. PhD was from Westminster University, so a long tradition back to European scholarship in media and communications. She's expert in critical AI, the relationship between data capitalism, AI, and the climate crisis, and environmental communication, so a broad area. But from our perspective, for investigating cognitive AI, a really rising and highly important topic. She is author of many, many papers, books, chapters. I only want to highlight a few of them, which are, from my point of view, very important, but of course it's always a subjective point of view. 2017, Benedetta edited a volume at Palgrave with the title Carbon, Capitalism and Communication, together with Graham Murdoch. So I would say she was really one of the ones who really pushed the topic at a moment of time where nobody was really interested in researching questions of climate from that perspective. So we just had a chat before. Typically, scholars of media and communication, when they investigate questions of climate, it is really about climate communication, the sense of coverage. I think this was really one book showing that a different perspective is necessary. 2018, Benedetta edited another book in that realm, Climate Change in the Media, at Peter Lang, together with Justin Lewis. One of the books I really love, which was published in 21, if I remember it correctly, was Is AI Good for the Planet? So which even broadened the topic. And as Benedetta just said, when we were talking about with each other, preparing the talk for today, a book will be out in August at Routledge, together with Graham Murdoch and Michael Ward, with the title News Corporation Empire of Influence. So you see, it's a broader topic she addressed. I'm very proud that you are here presenting a paper with the title Between Power and Nature, Provocative Reflections for an Eco-Political Economy of AI. Thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you so much, Andreas, for the invitation. And thank you also to Philip for the organization of Oscar and everybody really for having me here tonight. It's a great pleasure precisely because we are witnessing also in the last 3 weeks an incredible upsurge in movements within the AI space. And I'm sure that you probably noticed, but if you haven't noticed, maybe after tonight you'll go home and try to use Google search. And you would have seen that in the last 3-4 weeks, Google has been very active in experimenting with communicative AI and very active in trying really to use communicative AI tools to revolutionize its search. In a way, this means that Google summaries that are called by Google the Google experience are like progressively starting to replace the solutions and the answers to our Google queries. And this is something that I would like, you to start reflecting on, because it's something that, of course, is changing also for us and for people that are investigating the way in which the environmental damages and cost of AI become relevant. It's something that I want to keep in mind. This major movement of replacing typical Google searches with AI and communicative AI. And of course, the rush is there. So of course, digital lords, I don't know if you know a bit of my scholarship, you will know that I love to call them in this way, because I think that actually tech giant doesn't convey the incredible power, the ideological, economic, political power that these tech giants hold. And you saw the rush, Apple immediately announcing the new iPhone with ChatGPT and this new combination. But what probably you haven't seen is that just a couple of days ago, and it would be lovely if this could move quickly, just a couple of days ago, it's stuck. Sorry. What I wanted to show you is that this new research that has been published by US-based Future Media, and I still don't have the slides, so I don't know exactly what's going on. It seems to be slightly stuck. So what happened is that for the first time, we have this company that published the first study done on the effect and the impact of using the so-called Google experience, so communicative AI, on the way in which our queries are handled. And I actually here have a very quick summary of what happened. And the interesting thing is that the research covered around 3,000 keyword searches across different genres of news article. And if you see what happens is that the links for topics with a very high online advertising revenue, so for example, food, health, and shopping, were booted down in the ranking. So it means that on average, they were booted down by 980 pixels, which means at the bottom of the typical page. So what does this mean is that, of course, in terms of our organization of knowledge, in terms of our aim also to try to make sense of information, trying to actually look for information, trying to build the kind of knowledge that makes sense, build the public sphere, inform ourselves. This is going to be incredibly revolutionary, right? Because we are not sent to the news websites. We are actually sent and kept on Google platform, and we are given directly Google summaries. And actually, you would have seen in media reporting that a lot of, I would say, tech solutionists would argue that this is probably is a good thing because we are wasting less time, and actually nobody stops us from looking at the news websites. But I had many conversations of the records with journalists and actually managers working for News Corp, for example, being incredibly worried. So the solution of a lot of news outlets has been already to rush to strike deals, for example, with OpenAI, which is something that News Corp as a global empire has done. But what does this mean in terms of the kind of bias that we will be exposed to? What does this mean in terms of the organization of knowledge? So this is all something that is happening in the last 3-4 weeks. So the acceleration is incredible. And this is also a great opportunity for us as communication scholars to really try to step in this debate, but also trying to make policymakers quickly reflect on what is happening, because these decisions that are made by global conglomerates, these decisions that are made by digital lords, are actually never really discussed with, policymakers, and never discussed with citizens. These decisions are taken and they're dumped on us because they are experimenting, they're playing a little bit, right? As if, for example, playing with the pharmaceutical drug would have been the same? Would they just release a product at the same level, or would it be a testing phase, a more actually like a thorough reflection on the impact? So this is actually something that is in the public domain. Less so the conversation around the biggest crisis that we're facing. So now we know that for the last 10 years, we've been informed that actually every year we are reaching a new record. Every year we're hitting a new record in terms of global warming. And you know, from the North Atlantic heat wave in spring 2023 to the wildfires, the floods, the Antarctic sea ice failure, we all know that 2023 has been the highest and the warmest on record, not just in the last decade, but in the last 100,000 years. And of course, we know that we saw one of the biggest drought, for example, in Europe. And we also know very well that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has issued in March last year what is being called the final warning. The final warning, why? Because this is the last time in which they figure that actually we have an opportunity to still meet the Paris Agreement. We still have an opportunity to stop the development. So we still have an opportunity to try to adjust. Before, if we go over the famous threshold of 1.5, you know, irreversible change to the climate will lead to constant increase of weather events and, you know, to a global warming that would be impossible to stop. And what is the time frame of this? I mean, I'm sure that you probably remember, but like to keep between the 1.5 limit, emission needs to be reduced by at least 43%. When? Do you know? By when? 43%?
2030.
Yes, it means 6 years from now, right? Then we need to reduce them by something like 60% by 2035. So this is the last warning. We are talking 6 years from now. We're not talking 50 years, 100 years. Okay, so, but this type of news, I don't know, somehow they're thinking, somehow we receive it, but then do we engage enough as communication scholars with this crisis that we're facing? Now, of course, we're not just facing this crisis, and I am one of of the many scholars that are arguing that wars are also the enemy of the climate crisis. And actually, what's happening in the world is unacceptable also from the perspective of the crisis. But because we are communication scholars, I think we have a duty to actually do more to try to make sense of the crisis that we're facing, and also the acceleration. Because, as we know, like data-driven communication systems and AI are actually at the center of an evolution, at the center of a sort of a revolution that I also described in the last 4 weeks, that, I mean, put us in a very specific situation, and in my view, gave us this very special role that, you know, should, you know, really push us to engage and ask one of the crucial questions, which is like, what does this acceleration of AI-driven communication systems and AI mean for the climate crisis? And also, what are really the environmental harms? What are really the costs of this acceleration and the development and the acceleration of communication systems and AI? So, like, obviously, whenever we hear about AI, I'm sure that whenever you're also teaching about AI, we know very well that our students consider AI as one of the solutions to the biggest crisis of the planet. It's very common. Like if I speak, you know, about AI, they're asking me, so how is it that it's gonna sort chronic disease? How is it that it's gonna reduce the climate crisis? How is it that we can use it for marvelous health solutions? But I would argue that the discourse, the public discourse around AI is changing also within the relation to the climate. And actually, I want you to pay attention to this because we see a slight change in the discourse on AI and the climate. And it's interesting because we see that the two major issues that finally made it within the public sphere, within the public domain, are the issues of energy and the issues around water consumption. And these two issues, I would argue again, are very connected to the incredible uptake of communicative AI. So just bear it with me for a second. What is really interesting and fascinating from a public communication perspective is the way in which, for the first time, we see digital lords in the West admitting that there is a problem, admitting that data centers consume a massive amount of energy, and therefore having to try to find solutions also to the water consumptions. And we see them arguing, but we also saw just last year the publication for the first time of the sustainability report by Microsoft, having to acknowledge that yes, they have a problem, and yes, this problem is majorly due to OpenAI, and the consumption of water reached between 2021 and 2022 around 1.7 billion gallons. And in the report, they acknowledged also that this was due specifically to research and developments within OpenAI. Fascinating, because for years, Microsoft has been at the forefront of sustainability, arguing to be also reaching negative input in terms of carbon emissions. So very interesting. And following the giants, we also see international institutions starting admitting, just a little bit, not massively, but for the first time we start seeing, for example, the European Commission Foresight report, very interesting declaration, information and communication technologies are responsible for 5 to 9% of global electricity use, and around 3%. To put this into perspective, the total transportation industry would amount to around 2% of the global emissions. So let's, always remember that we're talking about big, big consumption. And of course, they also acknowledge something that I've never seen before, which is the problem of digital waste and the problem of disposal, which is something that is becoming really an issue for Europe. And at the same time, I also wanted to show you that for the first time this year, just a few months ago, the International Energy Agency started talking about generative AI. And finally, and this is really a first for someone that has been monitoring these studies for a while, for the last 15 years, I'm really impressed that for the first time we see the International Energy Agency acknowledging the problem in their forecast. And what we learned from them is that training a large language model like OpenAI ChatGPT-3 consumes nearly 1,300 megawatt per hour per year. This means around 130 US households per year. Isn't it like a massive amount of energy? Is it really worth it for a society to consider that we want a tool also to experiment, to play? Is it something that we should be concerned with, that Google decides to experiment with the Google experience and to just consume this amount of energy for playing with Google searches? Is it something that we should accept, or should we be concerned about this? So the other data that I wanted you to reflect on is that a single Google search uses about 0.3 watt hours of electricity, while an average request to ChatGPT consumes about 3 watt hours, which is about 10 times more. So think for a moment, every day there are around 9 billion searches on Google. So the international agency alerts us that this would require roughly an amount of 10 etc. And what does this mean in the world? It means this, like, look at this interesting map of the world. The countries, obviously in the global south, because the way in which we're developing AI hasn't really changed our mode of production. So if you look at the global south, we'll see how many of these countries actually consume a year less than 500. And the blue ones are the ones that, of course, are consuming the most. So do we want to allow ChatGPT using this type of energy? Is it something so revolutionary that, like the penicillin, that the world would really want to use in the context of the climate crisis? Is it something that we find as fundamental for our civilization and our development? Or maybe we need to start thinking in terms of the way we are organizing production, the way we are commodifying nature, the way we are commodifying human beings and well-beings, instead of maybe placing the environment at the center of our decision-making. So I think that actually this picture was particularly significant. And then I actually thought I would never imagine Goldman Sachs chipping in this conversation and actually telling us that, yes, we have this big problem with energy, and announcing that there would be, in 5 years, an increase of 160% in terms of the energy consumption of AI. And of course, trying to warn us about this. And then we're only talking a little bit about electricity. But then, as I mentioned in the introduction, when I was talking about this change that Google is implementing, then there is water. And I think that this fascinating study by University of Riverside in California really focused on Microsoft and the fact that they consumed 700,000 liters of fresh water to train ChatGPT in its data centers. And I love the fact that they compared the amount of water needed to, for example, the production of BMW or Tesla cars. And this, of course, was all calculated on the basis of the training, not the inference, which we know, especially from Google, data, that we know that actually it's an energy, and the consumption of water will be roughly 60% of this amount. So again, very important data to consider. So, do we need to keep calculating and quantifying these two issues? Do we need to quantify the carbon emission, quantify the energy consumption and the water consumption? Or do we want, as communication scholars or political economy or communication scholars, start thinking in terms of the holistic way in which AI generates environmental damages? So is it just a quantifiable measure that we want to reach, or do we want to really understand what does it really mean to create a framework that understands the entire environmental damages? So this is something that has been, as Andreas highlighted, has been the focus of my scholarship for the last 15 years, because actually what I found in communication studies is, of course, as he mentioned, an obsession with text. So the idea of climate change is relevant for media and communication because of the way we communicate. And of course, the way in which we're communicating disasters, we're communicating the emerging crises, we're communicating solutions is crucial. But what I invite you also to do is to actually place the climate crisis at the center of communication system. That means to start looking at the links which are ideological and material of communication systems. And for this, I actually decided to really look at political economy to develop what I called an eco-political economy of AI. Why? Because I feel the political economy has failed in addressing the ecological challenges of communication systems and has not placed enough emphasis on this question. And political economy, I mean, I think you should know probably that delves, in questions around the production, distribution, exchange, and consumption of wealth, of income, of opportunities. But specifically, when we look at political economy of communication systems, we are asked to engage with broader fundamental questions that look at the political, at the economic, at the social and cultural processes in society, but also it pushes us to go beyond the technical issues. This is why quantifying energy, this is why the carbon footprint and the water footprint are not really enough to understand. So try to ask basic moral questions of justice, equality, and public good. So what does it mean to apply a political economy of communication framework to AI? It means to ask, at least, I would say, 4 questions. The usual one, who owns what? Who owns and controls the essential infrastructures of power of artificial intelligence? Who are the main players? What are the consequences of concentration of power in the hands of the major AI developers? The second entails the relationship between the AI industry with the states and the examination of how governmental policies and actions impact its values and development. And another concern, of course, is the AI industry production, which delves into questions concerning labor processes, relationship, managerial controls and workers, and of course, the interplay between artificial intelligence and the broader societal framework. So how is AI development mirroring dominant social structures in capitalist society? How is symbolic power used to legitimize power asymmetries within our imperialistic capitalist system? So all of these are questions that a political economic framework enhance and ask us, to concern and to be engaging with. But then there is a fifth one, and the fifth one is specifically to ask in relation with, how is AI development mirror the social structure in capitalist societies? Like, where does the climate crisis sit in all of this? And what does it mean to add to basic moral questions of justice, equality, and public good, also questions about environmental justice, questions about environmental damages that our communication systems are bringing together within. So as you can see, this is really not a very simple agenda. This is a very ambitious one. And it's something that requires investment of research and investigations that, I think require also moving beyond disciplines. The understanding of the ecological crisis means to really engage with environmental scientists, but understanding the damages at the local level really means to engage with indigenous local knowledges, for example, understanding the frameworks of colonialism, understanding the way in which the global supply chain of AI works. And this is why I have, starting with carbon capitalism, called for a framework and an investigation that really moves beyond the typical queries of communication scholars to engage with questions of environmental justice, but to consider and reconsider communication systems as infrastructures, machines, metrics that, of course, carry within problems of pollution, waste, disposal, but also carry the asymmetries of power that I discussed earlier. So, an eco-political economy of AI, the starting point, of course, for an understanding of the mapping of the environmental damages is to look at the entire global production and supply chain of AI. To do that, actually, I argued, and I've done this in, I think, at least 15 different publications, starting with the book, Is AI Good for the Planet? So starting with segment 1, the extraction of mineral resources, and looking, at the first segment. Of course, the extraction of rare metals is a huge issue that institutions, starting with the European Commission, are now finally engaging with. But then we have the second segment, the consumption, the training of AI models, the inference. What does it mean? And then we have the third, the disposal. Where are we bringing all these digital devices? And generative AI is even more problematic in this regard. And I don't know if you've been thinking about this, but the chips, the famous NVIDIA chips, are actually becoming huge issues in terms of disposal. And so again, generative AI is bringing to the surface all of these issues. But I find that the simplification of the framework through these three segments is particularly useful because it can also help us organizing research in a way in which, for example, when I map the way in which we are trying to make sense of all of this, I can see that within the first segment of the extraction of minerals, disciplines like geography has been at the forefront. Within the second, in energy consumption, disciplines like engineering and computer sciences have been at the forefront. With the third, we have geography, we have communication science, and we also have environmental politics, for example. But a lot of these concepts need to be brought together, because if we don't, we can't really have a full understanding of the entire complexity, the environmental damages caused by AI. So, just to give you an idea, and of course, I haven't mentioned the challenge of integrating in all of this indigenous concepts. Very important, because traditional indigenous knowledge is incredibly helpful in land management. And so whenever we are dealing with disposal, digital waste, or extraction, we see that indigenous knowledge has a lot to say, and these concepts are incredibly useful philosophically and theoretical for us to understand how to build this framework. So, starting with the extraction of rare metals, what does it really mean? If we, for example, use the work on techno-colonialism by Mirka Modiano that you came across, she showed the way in which communication technologies, in that case, she was referring to humanitarian communication, display colonial legacies. And I would argue that, of course, something very similar is happening in the extractionism and the violence of these imperialistic methodologies that are used to start extracting resources. And of course, with this, the reason why I'm constantly trying to repeat how important it is to consider this indigenous knowledge as a source of inspiration for us to try and understand what to do about it is precisely because they've been dealing with these issues for centuries. And we are here developing something that is considered to be new, but we are developing exactly in the same way in which we saw them creating and trying to resist all of this. And actually, especially geographers like Sovakul, for example, have been spending the last decades trying to understand what it means to appropriate land, to the concept of environmental damage when we are appropriating resources like this. And then in the second segment, I would say that computer science and engineering are at the core, and they can be incredibly helpful to understand. And actually, I'm sure that you all know the famous studies that was developed in 2019 by Struble, Ganesh, and McCallum, because it was the first one that recognized the problem of language models and energy consumption. Here, like in the book, I try to compare, what that meant. So, like, to a travel London to Rome, consuming something like 234 kilograms of carbon emission versus, a natural language processing model consuming 284,000 kilograms, again, to show the problem. But as I said, this is one segment. This is not the entire story. This is not the entire recollection of the environmental damages. And then we move to the third one, which is now becoming also the focus on studies done by the UN, because digital waste is something that is becoming progressively unmanageable. And I don't know if you know that in the world, we are actually recycling around 17% of digital waste at the moment. And if you see who are the major producers of digital waste and where are the regions that are the receivers, again, it becomes a map that reminds very much the map that I showed you earlier about the total electricity consumption per country. So again, understanding only the quantification that a discipline like engineering, for example, is giving us is only the starting point to understand the entire problem. Like, we need frameworks of data colonialism, techno-colonialism to understand where the problems are. If we really want to try to address the issues, if we want to try to reduce the environmental damages of AI. And I would also argue that in communication studies, we have examples of studies, and I'm referring to Jussi Parikka's work or Gabri's work on digital rubbish, for example, that are incredibly useful for us to develop the concepts that we can use for this framework. So I actually think that I've given you probably a lot to think about in terms of the challenge that we have when we try to really understand holistically the entire environmental damages produced by AI, trying to avoid a reductionist quantitative perspective that only sees the carbon footprint or the water footprint. And I think we really need to try to avoid, and we need to transcend this reductionist approach that simplify the environmental impacts, especially of communicative AI, and reduces these problems into mere calculable details. So if a dominant quantitative approach prevails, I'm concerned, and let's see if my prediction would stay, that in the next 5 years, we're going to see carbon markets developing for AI. And we're also going to see the development of self-regulatory measures initiated by only the industry, concentrating on calculating only the carbon footprint of AI. I don't know if you saw that there is a new bill at the Congress in the US that is doing precisely this and is actually mentioning environmental cost and suggesting for the digital lords to address the issues by self-regulating themselves, which is something that really worries me, because it would be just to dismiss the issue, as I just said, without addressing the problem we have. And I'm also worried about the possible introduction of new system of carbon credits for AI application. With its continuous commitment to better calculation, just like with carbon credits markets, I don't know if anybody of you has engaged with environmental studies or ecology studies or geography, but the major criticism, of course, to these carbon markets has been that the idea of doing better, having better calculation, having in 5 years better calculation so we can address the issues has been, a major criticism in the literature because the conclusion is that they're not really working to reduce carbon emissions, surprise, surprise. And as Carl Polanyi, which I think probably you read at some point, pointed out long ago, laissez-faire itself is an interventionist state project. Laissez-faire was always planned. And so an eco-political economy of AI can serve as a compass for our research. And it should prompt us to rekindle our imagination, to confront the profound transformation demanded by the climate emergency. And the starting point, in my view, should really be that nature and well-being should not be treated as commodities, as this approach of trying to quantify creating carbon markets for AI that has not developed yet, of course, but this should not be the only solution. And so I actually think that we can still decide to scale down less necessary forms of production and organize the economy around nature and human well-being instead of aiming only at continuous capital accumulation. Why not? Why does it have to be so difficult? So thank you for the opportunity, and I hope we can kick off a debate and a conversation about this. Well, the best historical reference would be COVID. Didn't we scale down very quickly on production and everything? Didn't we end up staying at home all around the world? And the funny thing is that despite the prediction of reducing carbon footprint, carbon emission have not been reduced. Why? Precisely because of this problem. So I actually think that if this development was happening in the 50s, where in Europe ideas of public service media were prevailing, we would have, sat down as they did in the past, BBC, ADF, ZDF, DR in Denmark, France Television, the south of Europe, and find and reach a conclusion that was the opposite of the conclusion that in the 60s was reached in the US, which was that media and communication systems were too important to leave them just to the market, and so it was important to intervene. And there was no problem with considering positive regulation. There was no problem with expecting a sort of public obligation on this type of technologies, because we thought, as citizens and as policymakers, that this was too relevant. So why was it possible in the 50s, and why, after the major failures of unregulated capitalism showed that inequality is on the rise, showed that the climate crisis is something that is real, shows that the climate crisis is connected to this type of unregulated consumerism, on unregulated consumption beyond our needs. And so why not actually trying? I mean, I understand that when I come to Europe and I see that only a right-wing discourse seems to prevail, then you think, wow, I mean, having to convince them that maybe we can scale down, maybe we can reconsider that a different approach. But I actually think that there is almost no counter-discourse to this right-wing public discourses is going on in Europe. I find that new ideas, I don't hear, for example, anymore ideas coming from Germany of degrowth. Where is degrowth? Where is the degrowth movement gone? The idea was always to place humans and the environment at the center and then take decisions. We all love technologies, otherwise we wouldn't do what we're doing. We're not Luddites, we're not. But we want to place humans and the environment first. And so I don't see why we couldn't demand a regulation that says before these products are placed in the market, we want to have a conversation about them. During COVID, this was done. Entire countries were shut down. So why can't we have this type of conversation about this AI development? I mean, we already know, for example, that the Global South is not catching up because they don't have enough infrastructures to be able to enjoy, this incredible acceleration. So again, we are simply constantly continuing the same imperialistic model of capitalism that, has got us in trouble. So isn't that the right time to argue? I mean, it might seem naive, but to be honest, when you think of the major changes of the last decades that brought Europe to have a war budget, well, I think that this would be less difficult. I've been thinking about this quite a lot, actually, and I think that the crucial thing is there is not just one policy tool, but there is obviously a set of policy tools that will need to be implemented. Okay, so I actually would start with something that is quite was quite popular in international law, international human rights law. So I would want to have a task force that will have countries sitting together to just discuss, as it was done with COP, for example, the issues around the environment, but in connection with the extreme, accelerated development of AI, okay? And then I would just, following the eco-political economy framework, I would just demand, to bring together the studies that are already available on the kind of environmental damages created at the level of segment 1, for example. So the land grabbing. The European Commission has predicted 3,000% increase of lithium needs in the EU. What does this mean for the Global South that produces it? Do you know where lithium is produced? Not in Europe. So why is it that we are accepting that we need this type of consumption of lithium if the countries that are producing it are telling us that they disagree with it? So, the studies are already there, but it's very difficult to place them together. I've been developing also this repository of research done on AI, bringing it together. That's why I discovered, for example, how geography studies has been at the forefront of studying precisely digital technologies and sustainability. And they never engage with AI, but the frameworks are exactly the same. And so we have all these studies that belong to different segments. We just need to bring them together. So in terms of regulatory framework, we start at the level of segment 1, and we check. We start at the level of segment 2, and we do exactly the same. I'm not saying that calculating the carbon footprint of AI is wrong. Actually, it's important, but we shouldn't leave that to the digital lords to do it, just as we did with the right to be forgotten. Was it a success in the end? No, I think we should try to reclaim as, independent authorities that are able to check. So we know what is the carbon footprint of any products that is going to be put in the market. Do we need a smart refrigerator that is able to tell me that my milk is running low at home and sends me a message on my Tesla, and then maybe it reconnects it to my little Tamagotchi, because now they're actually famous again. And we need neural networks to do that. Is it an application that is bringing joy, or is it an application that is bringing and enhancing the climate crisis? So these are the questions that we should be asking. And I think it's urgent. So I don't see why multiple intervention at every level of the segments. And the segments are useful precisely because there are different expertises involved. And the engineers and the energy experts are all engineers, computer scientists or energy experts that are calculating the waterproof and the computing and the carbon footprint are ready. They're investing everything they have in trying to do this calculation. So and I showed in the presentation how much we have now already, even on ChatGPT. So it's not true that we don't have this data. This is actually what they're telling me at the European Commission in the last 5 years. We don't have data. Well, now we do. And so we need to intervene. And yes, the US and China are not on board. Yes, but we start, the so-called Brussels effect. For antitrust, it's been quite successful. Of course, there is a lot of work that needs to be done, but I think that actually this is the way forward. When we look at the need to reduce drastically emission in 6 years, we are reminded that we can't really keep watching digital lords experimenting in this way without doing much, because we don't have this kind of time. 50 years ago, yes, maybe, but not now. So, I looked into also the possibility, for example, to have carbon footprint labels, attached to every device. Yes, useful, but these are not, in political economy. From a political economy perspective, blaming just the consumers that are going to buy a product, is not really a solution, but useful, because also consumers, it's important that they're engaging. From a policy perspective, part of the policy toolkit is what I call green environmental digital ethics. It's very important to have this kind of literacy. So green tech literacy, green AI literacy, very important, because a lot of this understanding at the moment is with us as communication scholars, but not in the schools. So I see actually UNESCO has been doing major projects on media literacy. And I try to reach out through IMCR to UNESCO because they seem to be interested in this. They want to run programs within schools, very important. But of course, the needs of a kid that is, do you know where is the biggest digital dump place in the world? The capital of digital waste? It's Nairobi, okay? So a kid in a school in Nairobi will probably need to understand digital waste as an issue, much more than the problems with, video games consumption prompted to AI. So how much a video games is consuming versus if you use it on mobile or if you use it at home on your desktop. So of course, these programs need to be adjusted. But these are all solutions, integrated solutions. And what do we do with this knowledge if we don't implement policies? And I know that the challenge is big, but I actually think that if we manage to shut off the world for quite a few years, we could do this. Well, to be honest, I don't see how that would be practical if we need to try to find solutions at the local level. For example, if you take the city of Nairobi, okay, I was talking to journalists because media scholars are not doing this type of research on digital waste at the moment. So it's investigative journalists that are risking their life trying to gather data. And the funny thing is that, you think of centralization, but in these countries and in these cities, the products that we are producing in China or in the Silicon Valley will never really be taken up unless a major investment is taking place. And I was actually mentioning this to Andreas earlier, that I was reading of these plans of the Kenyan government for major investments also in AI, and claiming that there would be a new Savannah Silicon Valley. Africa is going to be the new AI. And I just thought, but this is complete madness. If you think of the level of the depletion of resources that is really coming from Congo, is coming from Kenya. So, I'm really not sure how this could work. And actually, we know already that we're talking about digital lords of the West, and we're talking about digital lords of the East competing with each other. So centralization, not sure that would be the answer we need here.
I have 2 points I would maybe ask, maybe put emphasis on. So for me, when we talk about this dimension of AI, one of the most interesting thing in the discussion about a European AI Act was the absence of that topic. So while there was for the first time really the idea to build up a larger regulation to AI, it was really only a tiny topic at some corner, but it became not a big issue, while everybody knew what AI means when it comes to the cost of energy. So there I really would be interested in your perspective on that. If you see any reasons for that, or what might be an explanation for this. So this is my first question. The other thing, it's more a thought than a question. And it has something to do with the discussion which we had on degrowth and, let's say, the environmental movements, which are, I would say, in a crisis in Europe at a moment of time. My explanation for this is that they were not able to develop an imagination of a well-working future on the side of economics, or bringing economics in a new way together with the environment. So this was the point. So it was not a strong imagination about the future. It was just criticism highlighting the problems. And therefore, this meant a lot, at least from my perspective, for the move away from climate change movement, environmental movements, and so on in the last 2 years. And there I would see a big difference to the beginning of these movements in the 70s, when they were strong with having an idea about a new kind of future, a different kind of future. And there would, well, maybe you even might comment on that.
Yeah, well, I'll start with the second point. So we just finished a very interesting issue in Political Economy of Communication, the journal, that is coming out in the next month. And the issue is focused on the book by Greta Thunberg. And the book is a very interesting effort that brings together many environmental figures around the world. And for me, the reason why I wrote one of the introduction to the piece is that there is absolutely no mention of sustainability of AI and data-driven communication systems. And I just thought, I can't believe this, that it's still happening. So it's like environmental policy and environmentalism is completely disconnected from all of this. But this is actually very connected to the kind of society we are developing now, and they still don't see it, right? So this for me is something that is incredibly worrying. But at the same time, and this is what we're arguing in the issue, an opportunity for us as communication scholars, because this is our task to actually make sure that this silence, that we address this silence. I think that the environmental movement that was so strong, especially in Germany, was always a bit wishy-washy on growth. And this is also because the left, traditionally, and much part of the left, still thinks that it's possible to address the climate crisis and keep pushing growth. This is very interesting, especially if you look at the luxury eco-modernism movements. I don't know if you read Bastani, for example, in France, all the French radical left, they would argue it's possible to keep producing and at the same time addressing how do we do this? We use technology. So that's it. And I find this very contradictory, but also very contradictory to a level that brings to lack of ideas of what do we do next? How do we rearrange the economy, right? And so this might be really one of the problems of this loss of direction, right? At the same time, I was sitting in a panel with one of the green leaders for Bavaria, a few months ago. And her pitch at the beginning of the panel was the only way to address the climate crisis is to embrace technology. Technology will save us. And I just thought, this is really very interesting from a green party perspective. I really couldn't expect this. And I just thought this is really the kind of change that we probably couldn't imagine some years ago. But I think that, and I'm using Weber's words, when we lose the sense of enchantment in a society, and he was referring to religion, we need to replace enchantment with something else. And probably technology is our way to cling on something that is almost religious, to sort out something without really addressing the issues when we don't have really ideas and we say, well, it's technology is going to save us. So that's one thing. For the AI Act and the fact that there is almost no mention of the environment, there is absolutely not even a line, I was told again and again, also by lawyers involved, that it was because you're not bringing us an environmental impact assessment that is a good one. So the answer was always, it's too difficult to quantify. But my argument would be, we don't need to quantify, we need to understand the complexities, but that requires an analysis that goes beyond the quantification of the carbon footprint and look at the entire global supply chain. But it's possible. So I actually think that in the phase of compliance, because now we are at the stage in which the European Commission has just issued this call that I just saw last week for an AI office. So they're establishing an AI office, and they're actually calling for people to participate, and they're looking at a variety of perspectives. So it's not just going to be ethics or engineers. It's going to be, in theory, a variety of people. So I hope that actually there would be possibilities to intervene at the level of compliance, even if it's not, directly mentioned. Because I know that the Council of Europe is more sympathetic, and they're about to issue their position paper. So that's what I know. I mean, I'm a proud European in this, because I don't see anything better than the AI Act at the moment between Asia and the US, unfortunately. And I know that the world has also other priorities at the moment, but this is also why, considering the global crisis we are facing as communication scholars, this should be our priority.
Okay, well, thank you very much.